Well, hello, Madison Avenue. It's good to see you again today. Another Wednesday night Bible study that we're getting ready to prepare for. So thankful that you're able to be here with us. I'll get some text messages sent out here, and you should be able to download the handout and be able to watch the video and everything this evening at 7 o'clock. So thankful to have you here with us on Facebook and YouTube. I hope that you enjoy our lesson today. Today we're going to be in the fifth lesson of the journeys of Paul. We're going to be looking at Paul's third journey, and we've got a lot to get to, so let's dive right into it. Again, I would encourage you to read on your own the Bible reading for this lesson. The Bible reading for this lesson is found in Acts chapter number 18, verse 23, through Acts chapter number 21, verse number 16. So these are the sections that we're going to be looking at today, and looking at the journey that Paul takes here on his third trip out. So let's look at a couple of the points to begin this afternoon and evening. Let's look at a couple of our points of who Paul's traveling with and where they're going, and beginning here with these first couple of points. Number one, on this journey, Paul is traveling primarily with Timothy and Luke. Now, along the way, there's a few other people that help them. There's a few other people that maybe go from city to city and help, a few other people that go ahead of Paul and kind of help prepare some things for him in his journey. And so there are some others along the way, but I didn't take time to list all those out. Mainly, the people that are with Paul on this third journey are Timothy and Luke. So these are the men that we're going to be looking at for the most part. Paul, Timothy, and Luke, with several others sprinkled in along the way. Point number two, the main route that they're going to be taking on this journey is the route of Turkey, Greece, Lebanon, and Israel. And so you can see here they're on our map. If we can zoom into that briefly, they're going to be leaving Antioch. They're going to be heading north, and along this pathway, and we're going to see them make a couple of loops and then head back down here to the area of Lebanon, and then in Lebanon going south into Israel and ultimately leading to Jerusalem. So this is the main route and the main path that they're going to be taking on this third journey, okay? In this journey, they're traveling about 2,700 miles. Their second journey was the longest journey. It was about 2,800 miles. This one was a little bit shorter, but we see them looping back around and visiting some other places in this journey, okay? Like the first two journeys, this journey also begins in Antioch. They're there in Antioch. They're going to be sent out again by Antioch, and they're going to be visiting a few places that they've already visited in the first journey, a few places they visited in the second journey, and they'll also be visiting a few new places in this third journey as well. Let's get right into it, okay? Let's start looking at some of these different journeys, some of these different stops in this third journey that Paul's going to be making. And the first stops on this third journey are a little bit ambiguous. We don't really know exactly where Paul is stopping on each of these. We just know this. Verse number 23 in Acts chapter 18, we have this here. So let's read that together. In verse number 23, it says, "And after he had spent some time there, which is Antioch, he departed and went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order strengthening all the disciples." And so we can see there's a little bit of ambiguous terms here. We don't know exactly where all of his stops were. We do know this, though. Let's look at what we do know. There were several areas, several churches that Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy, that they had worked together to establish in this region. So as we look back here in this, our artists that have kind of drawn this map for us have looped them up and around and coming down here towards Ephesus. This is going to be the first major stop, and we'll talk about that here in just a few minutes, okay? But as they're looping down and around here, our artist that drew this map kind of brought them up north and then back down and around. But you'll notice that right in this area, look what they're passing right by. Once again, they're passing by areas like Derbe and Iconium, Lystra and Antioch. They're coming near Sardis and Philadelphia and Laodicea and Colossae. And so, which stops did they make exactly? We don't know. But here's what we do know. The Bible here tells us that they went over all the country, strengthening all the disciples. So did they stop at every single place? Maybe not. But I believe they stopped at many of them. They would have stopped and they would have checked in. They would have seen how those churches were doing, how those disciples were doing, how the pastors were doing. And so they would have made as many of those stops as possible. So while the third journey begins a little bit ambiguous, doesn't give us all the exact detail at the start, you'll notice as little detail at the beginning as there's that much detail at the end. At the end, Luke gives us every name of every stop on every day, and we'll get to that here in just a few minutes, okay? Number 6, Paul's next stop would be back in Ephesus. So while his first few stops, we don't know exactly which route he took. We know that ultimately it was leading here on our map to the town of Ephesus. And so this is where we're headed. Here, if you can see my mouse circling that, I believe that you can. That's where we're going. We're heading to this major stop in Ephesus. Now, Ephesus was an important stop for Paul in his second journey as well. And now we see him going back to Ephesus. And I do want to go back and rewind a little bit to last week's lesson. There was a detail that I did not share with you last week that I kind of skimmed over. And in the scheme of last week's lesson, it was not important. It wasn't an important detail at that time, but it is an important detail now. So I want to go back to it and revisit it for just a moment. You see, as Paul's heading back to Ephesus, Ephesus is not there kind of fighting on its own. Ephesus still has a couple of people there that are leading them, that are guiding them, that are helping them through these difficult times, and those people are Priscilla and Aquila. You see, when Paul left on his second journey, left Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila followed along with him and started that journey. But you see, Priscilla and Aquila did not go back to Jerusalem with Paul. They didn't go on any further. The Bible actually records back in verse number 19 of chapter 18, it tells us that Paul left Priscilla and Aquila there in Ephesus. Their goal and their purpose was to lead the church there in Ephesus. They were going to instruct them and lead them and guide them until Paul could return. And so they did not go down to Jerusalem. They did not go into Antioch. They stayed there in Ephesus. Well, back in Ephesus, before Paul gets back to town, again, Priscilla and Aquila is kind of leading the church there, leading the disciples, leading those that are involved. But there's another man that's doing a great work there as well, and his name is Apollos. Apollos, the Bible tells us, was a powerful speaker. People loved listening to him, loved hearing all the things that God had done for him. And so Apollos was a powerful speaker, and he was winning people for God, and which is a great thing. We're very glad to hear that he was doing that. But in doing so, Apollos had gotten confused on a few things. And you know, here's the major difference that I want to make sure that I share with all of you and that everybody understands. There's a major difference between somebody preaching a false gospel and purposefully doing it, being that wolf in sheep's clothing, going in and teaching a false gospel for the purpose of financial gain, for the purpose of becoming famous on the media and on the internet and TV. You see, there's a difference in purposefully leading people astray and then someone else who ignorantly, innocently is doing something, but is willing to open themselves up for teaching and for correction, for reproof, and for correcting, for correcting what they have done wrong. And so that's the exact circumstance that we're finding here. We're seeing that that Apollos is doing a great work, but there's something that he's doing that is wrong. As he's winning people to Jesus, as he's teaching the gospel message and people are accepting Christ, what he's doing wrong is he's going out and he's teaching the baptism of John the Baptist. And he's baptizing them, instead of baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, baptizing them into a church that has been established by Jesus Christ. You see, he's going around and he's baptizing them in the baptism of John. And he's baptizing them in the name of John because it's what he knew. It's how he was baptized. It's how he was taught. And so he really didn't know any better. It was an ignorance factor. It was he hadn't learned it yet. And so Priscilla and Aquila are there and they're leading this area. They're leading this church and they're leading this people. And they don't go and jump all over Apollos. They don't go and they don't publicly tear him down and humiliate him. You see, they go and they pull him aside privately. And they bring him aside and they teach him the proper way. And they say, listen, Apollos, you're doing a great job. You're teaching Jesus. You're teaching salvation. People are being saved. But here's the problem. Jesus didn't establish John's baptism. Jesus established the baptism that belonged to the church. You see, John was the only person ever given the power to baptize. After John's death, the power of baptism, the authority of baptism lied within the local church. And because it lied within the local church, you see, today, I don't have the power to baptize. Madison Avenue Missionary Baptist Church has that authority and that power. And that power and authority has been given to the local church. And as such, the church gives me the authority to baptize. The church tells me that it's my responsibility. If I had a broken arm or broken leg, anybody that the church so elects and deems to do it could do it. And so the power did not lie within Apollos. The power needed to lie within the church there at Ephesus. And so Priscilla and Aquila bring him aside, explain that to him more perfectly. And this was an important moment in this church's time. And let me just share this with you today because I think it's important for all of us to understand. You see, Priscilla and Aquila were the ones that were left there by Paul to minister to these people. And Priscilla and Aquila didn't pull Apollos aside and say, oh, wait until Paul gets here. Wait until Paul. We're going to tell Paul everything that you did. We're going to let Paul take care of this. No, you see, Priscilla and Aquila didn't do that. Priscilla and Aquila said, you know what? Paul left us in charge. We need to take care of this. We don't need to burden Paul with this. This is something that we can do. It's something that we're going to handle. And this was the proper way of doing this. Paul did not have to worry about it. He didn't have to stress out about it. They didn't have to write him. They didn't have to call him. Of course, we know they couldn't have called him, but you all understand what I'm trying to say here. What I'm trying to say is Paul left capable people in charge. Priscilla and Aquila was capable and able of taking care of this. Now, and so this is a model that we should follow. And I heard someone say it this way one time, and this is how we need to be willing. It's number one, you need to watch me in how I'm doing it. Then number two, you need to help me in how we are doing it. And then number three, I'm going to help you do it. And then number four, I'm going to watch you do it. And once we've accomplished those 4 steps, it's all you. It's all yours. And so Priscilla and Aquila, they had watched Paul. They had helped Paul. Paul had in turn helped them. And now it was time for Paul to watch them do it. It was time for Paul to let them handle those situations. And so Priscilla and Aquila is now handling these things. Priscilla and Aquila is going to take care of it. And this is discipleship in action. They didn't have to get Paul involved. Paul didn't have to come in and handle it. Aquila and Priscilla took care of the situation then, there, and now. So they pulled Apollos aside. They taught him more perfectly so that Apollos could continue on. Now here's the awesome part. They taught Apollos the proper way to do these things, and as they taught Apollos the proper way to do these things, they sent him out, and Apollos went on to Ephesus, went on to Corinth, and in Corinth, Apollos continued to preach. and continue to teach, continue to see people saved. And so what an awesome testimony to realize that Apollos was not beaten down and kind of roped down and told he couldn't do it anymore. Apollos was just simply explained more perfectly the Scriptures, taught the Scriptures, and then, you know what, you're doing an awesome job, continue to go out there and do what you need to do. And so that's exactly what happened. Apollos continued to preach the gospel message. Well, let's continue on to point number 10. Now Paul is going to arrive back in Ephesus. He's visited the churches out here in Asia Minor. Maybe he's visited Iconium, Derbe. Maybe he's visited Antioch. Maybe he's visited Philadelphia, Laodicea, and Colossae. Maybe he's visited some of these, and he's finally made his way to Ephesus. So Paul gets there into Ephesus, and now that he's there, he's going to gather the believers together whom Apollos had wrongfully baptized. And Paul's going to gather them together, and he's going to say, hey, listen, I know that you're saved. I know Apollos was a great teacher. Apollos was teaching you the truth of salvation. But here's the reality. Aquila and Priscilla had to pull Apollos aside and teach Apollos the truth of this. And now that I am here, I'm having to pull you aside, you 12 men. I'm having to pull you aside and teach you a little bit more clearly. And here's the reality. The reality is that while you're saved, while you know the truth of Jesus Christ, you've been wrongfully baptized. And so I'm going to need to rebaptize you. And so Paul is teaching them that there is an order and there is a way to do things. And while Apollos was doing a great job of teaching the truth, his baptism was wrong. And because his baptism was wrong, it's here in Ephesus where we read that the men had to be rebaptized. And so there was about 10 men there that needed to be rebaptized. We can read about that in verse number 7 of chapter 19. And Paul did this, and these 12 men willfully allowed this to happen. They didn't throw a fit. We don't need to be rebaptized, blah, blah, blah. They willfully said, you know what, if that's what we need to do, then we're going to do it. And so that's exactly what happened. Well, while they're in Ephesus, we can read in verses 8 through 10. We can put a couple of different verses together, and we can find out that Paul stayed in Ephesus for a period of about 2 years and 3 months. So again, he stayed quite a long period of time there. He loved the people of Ephesus. The people of Ephesus loved him. Verse number 21 shows us that Paul now has a purpose to revisit some of the churches that he established on his second journey there in Macedonia. And so he's going to get ready to leave Ephesus, and he's going to go into Macedonia, and he's going to revisit a few of these places. Let me drag our map there so you can see. As he leaves Ephesus, we're going to see him go over here, and this should look somewhat familiar to you to what we were looking at over the past 2 weeks. In that second journey of Paul. So Paul's going to purpose in his heart to do all of this, but before he leaves Ephesus, he's going to send Timothy and Erastus. If I'm saying that right, I'm probably not, but Erastus is going to go ahead of them with Timothy, and he's going to prepare the way for Paul to come. And so Timothy and Erastus head out to Macedonia. They head out towards Thessalonica and Berea and that area, and Paul stays behind to kind of tie up some loose ends. And so we see that in chapter number 20 and verse number 1 shows us that Paul is now going to depart towards Macedonia. Now, let me just pause here for a moment. My mind kind of went this way, and the Lord's impressing this upon me. I do feel it's important to share with you. At the end of chapter number 19, there's a very important story. For time's sake, we're not going to go through it, okay? But the end of chapter 19's got a very important story that I want to make sure to share with you, to go back and read. There's a very important thing that happens in Ephesus before Paul leaves. As Paul's kind of tying up these last ends, these loose ends, there's some important things that take place. And again, they're at the end of chapter number 19 here. I would encourage you to go. There's a riot that happens at Ephesus. There's some things that happen. Paul has some teachings here at the end of chapter number 19 that are very important. And I would encourage you to go back and read that. So again, we're not going to take time to read through it, but there's some important things that are given to us here about the blasphemers. Just some important detail that I think that you need to go back and read. So go back to the end of chapter number 19 and read that, all right? But for the sake of time and for the sake of our study, we're not going to be looking at that this evening. Let's go on into chapter number 20. So chapter 20, verse number 1, gives us another very ambiguous map, all right? It says this. In chapter number 20, verse number 1 and 2, look what it says. It says, and after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples, and he embraced them and departed for to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece. And so we see here, it just says, when he had gone over those parts. Verse number 1 tells us he departed into Macedonia. Well, Macedonia was a large place. Macedonia had a lot of stops that he made in that second journey. And so the best that we can do is we can say we know where he stopped in the second journey. We know he would have reason to stop at those places again to check in on the churches, to check in on the disciples, the pastors, the people. So he'd have reason to do that. And so while verses 1 and 2 don't give us a ton of detail, we know that he's going back to that general area, and we can kind of assume that he's going to make those stops. And so the first assumed stop, if you follow our map here, going from Ephesus up through the Aegean Sea, the first stop we can assume that he's going to make is Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, he's probably going to head south towards Berea. And then the Bible tells us in verse number 2 there, it says that he came into Greece. Now, even though Berea looks like it's in Greece, Greece was known more for that southern part of Greece, down here near Athens and Corinth. And so that's what's meant when it says he came into Greece. We know from a few other passages in the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, as well as a few other places, we know that he didn't go back down here to Athens, he went back down here to Corinth, okay? And so he comes back down here into Corinth, and the Bible tells us there in verse number 3 that while he was in Corinth, he abode there for 3 months. So we can get a little bit of detail there of what's going on. So he had gone over those parts. We don't know the exact route that he took, but we know that he would have revisited those places from his second journey. It's just assumed he visited Thessalonica and Berea and then headed towards Corinth. He was there in Corinth for a total of 3 months. Paul was then about to sail for Antioch. While he was there in Corinth, the Bible tells us that he had anticipation to sail back to Syria, to go back to Antioch. That was his original thought, and his original plan was to leave from Corinth here and sail. Let me kind of zoom back out so we can see it a little bit better. But the original plan was for him to set sail from Corinth and just go right back up here to Antioch. That was the original idea and the original plan. But the Spirit impressed upon him and said, no, you need to go back into Macedonia. And so he did. So he leaves Corinth. He goes back up here into Macedonia, back towards the area of Berea, back towards Thessalonica. And we can see that they're heading back towards this region. As he goes back towards there, verse number 6 of this passage, let me get there. Verse number 6 tells us that they sailed away and they came to Philippi, and from Philippi they went unto Troas. And so we can see that this was a 5-day journey to go from Philippi to Troas, and then they stayed in Troas for a total of 7 days. So they're coming from Corinth here on the map. They're coming back up to Berea, Thessalonica, and Amphipolis, if I'm saying that right, to Philippi, and then from Philippi down here, they're going to have to sail on the sea from Philippi down here to Troas, okay? And this was a 5-day journey. To go from Philippi to Troas in their day on their ships, it was a 5-day journey to go here, okay? Now they are in Troas. They're going to stay in Troas for a total of 7 days. Point number 19 in your handout. It is here in Troas we read about Paul preaching so long that he killed a man. Now we almost get a little bit of a chuckle out of that. that he was preaching so long that somebody literally fell asleep and fell out of a window, and as he fell out of the window, he broke his back or his neck or whatever happened, and the Bible says that he died. And while we try to kind of make light of that sometimes with how long certain preachers like to preach, joking aside, it actually turned out to be a very powerful message. It was a witness of the power of God. This man that fell out of the window died, and Paul went out and hugged him and brought him back to life. And so it ended up being a very powerful testimony to the people there in Troas. From Troas, they set sail to Assos. From Assos, they came to Mytilene, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. From Mytilene to Chios. From Chios to Samos. From Samos to Trigyllium. From Trigyllium to Miletus. And here they purposely, and I want to point this out, they purposely sailed around Ephesus. Paul knew if he went back to Ephesus, he wouldn't be able to leave. He loved Ephesus. The people in Ephesus loved him. And Paul knew if he stopped there that he'd get held back and that he'd be held for a long time. And he didn't want to get held back because the Bible tells us that Paul had a purpose and a reason to get back to Jerusalem. He wanted to get back into Jerusalem in time for Pentecost. And so Paul says, I'm not going to go into Ephesus. If I go to Ephesus, I'll never make it to Jerusalem on time. And so he doesn't go to Ephesus. He stops there at Miletus. And there at Miletus, it's very close to Ephesus. Let me kind of, let's blow that up a little bit. You can see it right here in this region. They've sailed along all of these different islands here, and they're pulling into Miletus. Well, Miletus is very close to Ephesus. And so while he's there in Miletus, Paul sends for the leaders, for the elders of the church in Ephesus to come down. And so they come down to Miletus and they meet Paul there for a little bit of a conference, we might say, all right? And so they meet him there after a long period of instruction. And this is an important period here. I would encourage you to go and read this. This is in Acts chapter number 20, starting at verse number 17, and going down, I believe, to the end of the chapter. Yes, all the way down to verse number 38. You'll see some important things here, and I would encourage you to go back and read that as well. But after a long instruction period, it's finally time for Paul to leave. Paul basically tells them, I know what's coming. I'm going to get arrested. I'll probably never make it back here. This is my final time seeing you, your final time seeing me. And so they're very upset about Paul's time of leaving. Verses 37 and 38, we can read the despair. We can read how upset they are. It says they all wept sore and fell upon Paul's neck and kissed him, sorrowing most of all for the words which he spake, that they should see his face no more. And so we can see the love, we can see the compassion that they had for Paul and that Paul had for them. So a very close relationship there in Ephesus. After leaving Miletus, Luke records many stops. And so now you can see Luke starting to record a whole lot of detail, all right? They leave Miletus, and Luke records these stops in order. Kos, Rhodes, Patara, Phoenicia. They saw Cyprus. I find this very interesting. In chapter number 21, the Bible records that they saw Cyprus on their left hand. Look at verse number 3 here. I want to read that to you. I just find this to be a very interesting piece of detail. It says that they had discovered Cyprus. They saw Cyprus on their left hand, but they sailed around it into Syria. And so they didn't stop. Okay? So they saw Cyprus, but they did not stop, and they went on to Tyre. Once in Tyre, they tarried there for a total of 7 days. From Tyre, they came to Ptolemais. In Ptolemais, they continued on to on to Caesarea. And now that they're in Caesarea, they're going to stay in Caesarea for several days, and they're going to stay with Philip. Philip housed them there for many days. Several things happen there. Again, we don't have time to go into all of them. Go back into chapter number 21. There's some very awesome things, some very interesting things that happen here between verse number 8 and verse number 12. So I encourage you to go there and read that. But long story short, I'm going to wrap it up into just a few short phrases for you. While they're there at the house of Philip in Caesarea, there are warnings that come to Paul. Tell Paul, don't go down into Jerusalem. If you go down into Jerusalem, you're going to get arrested. If you get arrested, you're going to be put to death. And after many warnings, Paul says, you know what? God is in control. If that's what God's will is, I'm fine with it. Let's go anyways. I want to go down into Jerusalem. And so Paul finishes his third journey by going down into Jerusalem for Pentecost. So that brings us to a conclusion of the third journey. You can see here, let me zoom back out on our map so you can see all the different stops that we've looked at this evening, starting here in Antioch, looping their way up to Ephesus, from Ephesus over into Macedonia, down to Corinth, back up into Macedonia, over to Troas, down through the Aegean Sea, into the Mediterranean Sea, and ultimately leading them down here into Jerusalem. So these are the stops that we looked at this evening. This was Paul's third journey, and there's a lot of information in there that we didn't even get to touch. So I'd encourage you again, go back, read those passages. This week's Bible reading was Acts chapter number 18 through Acts chapter number 21. So I'll blow it up there so you can see it real good and bold. I encourage you to go back and read that if you've not done it already. Thank you for being here this evening. So glad that you're able to join us for this short Bible study. I hope that you enjoyed it. Come back next week. We'll be looking at the fourth journey of the Apostle Paul. Have a wonderful evening. Stay safe. God bless you.